Good morning. It's 9:30 here in the UK on a Saturday morning. Before I get into it, apologies in advance for my appearance today. I appreciate the hair isn't looking its normal, perfect self. I appreciate the stubble hasn't been done, so I'm probably not looking my best. Speaking frankly with you, just got out of bed, got a pretty busy Sunday ahead of me, so I wanted to sit down and get some thoughts recorded ASAP, basically. So without further ado, I'll crack onto it. Thanks to everyone who's recently subscribed to the channel. Got some more videos planned. I've got a video that I did with Ultratech Sports that's going to come up on the channel very, very soon indeed. And it's a busy time in boxing at the minute. There's a lot to talk about after last night's shows on Sky and out in the States with PBC. So just a brief run through of certain things to discuss or potentially to touch on during this discussion. David Price, Carl Frost as a commentator, David Hay as a commentator, Kell Brooks chin, Kell Brooks double chin, Kell Brooks triple chin, Luke Campbell versus Tommy Coyle, Scott Quigg versus Kiko Martinez, Carl Frampton versus Gonzalez, Scott Quigg versus Carl Frampton, Arreola versus Fred Cassie, Arreola versus Deontay Wilder, Arthur Abraham, Anthony Crolla, Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. So, bloody hell, it's a daunting list of stuff to go through. Won't necessarily have to go through it all. Yeah, we could touch on a few bits, and as always with these kind of discussions, I'm happy to let the chat and the back and forth guide in which direction we take it. You know, I'm not going to be overly structured and say that things have to be discussed in a certain order. As I always say, if you want to hear me discuss something, then I'm here to discuss it, and I much rather, the back and forth discussing rather than me just ranting at the camera. So without further ado, let's get into it. Let's start with the Sky Sports programme last night, and let's talk about the fights that were on the card. Opened with Tyrone Nurse versus Dave Ryan. The second fight on the card was Sam Eggington versus Glenn Foote. We then had Martin Murray against the international opponent in an 8-rounder. We had Scott Quigg versus Kiko Martinez, and we had Anthony Crolla versus Darley's Perez. So, because of the amount of stuff that we've got to get through in this chat, I'm going to quickly sweep through the first 3 fights in one. Tyrone Nurse versus Chris Jenkins. I thought I agreed with general consensus here was that if anything, Tyrone Nurse, deserved to win this fight. Nurse is an interesting fighter, really. He's quite perplexing. He reminds me somewhat of Malik Scott in the heavyweight division. Yeah, he's got so many moves. He's so slick. He's got excellent skills. And you've got to remember with Tyrone Nurse, he's only 25 and he's had a ridiculous amount of fights given how young he is in his career. Yeah, he's a real durable opponent with a lot of skills, a lot of tricks. And I thought he was too skillful and, quite frankly, too advanced for Chris Jenkins in this fight. Yeah, I thought Chris Jenkins started very fast, looked suppressed to the action, but fundamentally Tyrone Nurse was able just to get on top by consistently having the smoother action and the better work. I think the issue with Tyrone Nurse is his lack of power and his lack of pressure in the ring. Sometimes gives him like a look of apathy, and it doesn't look like he's an overly motivated fighter in there. It doesn't look like he's got this huge burning desire to win and to get the W. And whilst he sort of picks at opponents and scores well-structured points against opponents, he doesn't necessarily hurt them. He doesn't necessarily rock them. He doesn't necessarily deter them from their game plan. And I wonder whether that is potentially why he's, not improved above this level already, to be honest. So, brief thoughts on Tyrone Nurse there. Moving swiftly on, Sam Eggington versus Glenn Foot. One-sided fight, Eggington winning pretty much every round, dominating with boxing, not getting sucked into a scrap, sticking to his fundamentals. You have to say it's a good bit of business, this, from Eddie Hearn. You know, he picked up Sam Eggington from Prize Fighter. He didn't even win Prize Fighter, if I recall correctly. I think he actually lost in Prize Fighter. But Hearn sort of saw some of the stuff he was doing, saw the fact he was like 20 years old, and thought he's going to put some time and some money into him. Especially with, at the time, Birmingham being a big hotspot for Eddie Hearn. But yeah, Eggington's improving. And when you've got a fighter so young and so rangy, and, you know, taking the game so seriously, it's quite unclear how high his upside could actually be. You know, people on Twitter were talking about Eggington versus Frankie Gavin. I got to say, that's a fight that is only going to be of interest to Birmingham as a city. Yeah, we're talking. Sam Eggington is not known to anyone outside hardcore boxing circles. Frankie Gavin is you know, a fighter that only a mother could love. You know, quite frankly, I put up a tweet last night saying Eggington versus Gavin 2016 pay-per-view. Well, I certainly hope not. You know, they're not the most entertaining fighters. Eggington's more entertaining than Frankie Gavin, but yeah, maybe it's time to start moving Eggington up the ranks and getting him in with some international opposition. Sorry if you can see me fiddling away at the bottom of the screen, by the way. I've got my iPad here, and the reason I'm doing that is so I can look at the chat that people are leaving rather than going in and out on the computer, because that will kind of disturb the action on screen. So if you're watching, please let me know who you are, say hello, and let me know your thoughts on these fights. Martin Murray, another performance that could, you know, you'd rather watch paint dry. Martin Murray seems to be one of these guys who doesn't perform very well unless he's in a big fight. I mean, when I watched him against Triple G, I remember thinking, wow, if Murray could perform like that when he goes in these 8-rounders and these 10-rounders, he'd look dominant. He'd look like a really exciting fighter to watch. But he seems to have developed, you know, a technique of fighting quite scrappy fights where he smothers his work. I don't want to be over-harsing him. I know the opponent he was in with seemed to be bigger than him, you know, etc. But Murray didn't look like an absolute class act in that fight, to be honest. I know he won by 5th round stoppage, but it was, yeah, he was landing some clean shots from the opponent, but it was a charitable stoppage, you know. That opponent did not look like getting knocked out anytime soon. Yeah, it was just sort of outing for Martin Murray, if you like. The commentators were talking Callum Smith versus Martin Murray. These are two guys who I feel are overrated at 168 pounds, Callum Smith and Martin Murray. A fight between them at this stage I see as 50-50. I think Martin Murray would be the best opponent that Callum Smith's ever been in with. And I think that Martin Murray may be able to catch Smith and expose gaps in his game. Fundamentally, I'm not completely sold on Martin Murray at 168 pound now. Yeah, realistically, Martin Murray is a guy who got through at middleweight, trading on the fact that he was so big, so strong, so durable. And now at 168 pounds, it's unclear whether he's going to have that same gap in his game, I guess. Like, if you look last night, the opponent, I know the opponent was a light heavyweight coming down, but the opponent was a lot bigger than him. I reckon Callum Smith would be a lot bigger than him. I reckon Smith would have bigger range than him. And it's a fight that I see as 50-50, although, if I'm honest, it's a fight that doesn't excite me. Tivertap's joined in. It's a night of low blows, bad judging, chubby fighters, and surprise performances. Yeah. There was a lot of low blows, wasn't there? A lot of low blows. A lot of dodgy judging decisions. The fight, the fighters, it was bizarre. I mean, Chris Arreola in the States, he had 3 bellies. Cal Brook, a lot of people on my Twitter were saying he looked like Nassim Hamed. I'm not a fighting Nassim Hamed, a modern Nassim Hamed. He looked horrific at ringside. Horrific. He was sitting there, literally chins doubling up, like dripping in sweat down his forehead. He did not look like an athlete. And let me tell you, there was still some talk about would Brook versus Rios happen. Looking at that, it's clearly not happening. Looking at that, Kell Brook is having some substantial time out of the ring. To me, I don't want to be too harsh on him, but he looked worse than, maybe even worse than Adrian Broner when he blew up. Kell Brook looked really, really, you know, borderline in there, how overweight he looked. Similarly, your boy David Haymaker Hay on ITV, he didn't exactly look like the combat was on. You know, all this talk about whenever the David Hay turnaround is, and whenever we're going to see the Haymaker back in the ring, he didn't look like he was primed and ready for action either. He wasn't as fat as Kell Brook, but yeah, it was. Yeah, he looked like he'd been enjoying a few burgers. Let's put it that way. There were a lot of fat fighters there, certainly. You make a fair point to the top. Mr. Cutsy says, and there were a lot of draws. Ha ha. Yeah, obviously Crolla dropped to draw, Tyrone Nurse dropped to draw. So yeah, there are certainly draws on so. Anyway, we've discussed the undercard action for the Manchester. So let's move on to the two main cards: Quigg versus Kiko Martinez. Now, my opinion here. Joe has joined the chat. Nice to meet you too, Joe. Thanks for joining in. My opinion on Scott Quigg may not be a popular one after this. I am not overly impressed with this performance. Let me rephrase that. So the performance was good, I suppose. Let me take that back and rephrase that. I am still not overly impressed with Scott Quigg following on from this performance. Let me tell you why. Quigg looked monstrous at the weight compared to Kiko Martinez. If you watch my pre-fight video, I think I've made points about Kiko Martinez potentially fighting in the weight class below. You could really see that. Quigg looks a weight class above this guy. Kiko Martinez didn't look very fresh in the ring. Yeah, he looked old, he looked a bit haggard, he looked a bit shot worn. Now, in the first round, Martinez gives Quigg all sorts of problems. You know what Martinez does, front foot heavy, relentlessly coming forward, pushing you on the back foot. Kiko Martinez won the first round in my book, quite convincingly. Scott Quigg was young enough, athletic enough, he was able to move enough, he was able to jab enough to stop it being a really bad first round. He was able to get on his back foot, he was able to circle, you know, he did some basics well defensively. But it was a strong first round for Kiko Martinez. And after that, I did start thinking this fight is more of a 50-50 fight. Now, Quigg, who was a much bigger, younger man, again was put on his back foot early in round 2 and caught Kiko Martinez, caught him, dropped him. Yeah, Quigg clearly has an element of punching power. But for me, I'm not convinced over Quigg's punching power. We've all seen Quigg in fights which have gone the distance. You know, I remember the Belly Cleverly pay-per-view card, that performance. I remember Salinas. You know, Quigg goes 12 rounds with non-world beaters. You know, Quigg is not an immense power puncher. He's no Gennady Golovkin at super bantam. You know, if you look at Quigg's KO ratio and the type of opponents who've gone the distance with him, he is not a world-class puncher. So, quite frankly, Quigg caught Martinez well. Martinez left himself very open coming forward. Quigg dropped him, and Quigg finished the show. But, in many ways, this gave me as many concerns as I have about Scott Quigg, as many new concerns about Scott Quigg. I mean, the way he went after Kiko Martinez was reminiscent of Deontay Wilder chasing Audley Harrison around the ring. You know, Martinez was literally, Scott Quigg was literally throwing haymakers, like straight arm, looping, you know, real amateur style, desperate to get Kiko Martinez out. He was very lucky that he caught Martinez and ended the show. But two things could have happened. Number one, he was throwing like such a maniac, like a windmill puncher, that he could have gassed out and been a sitting duck for the experienced Martinez. Secondly, he could have got counterpunched, and he almost did by a sort of flailing Kiko Martinez. You know, Quigg was lucky he got the stoppage when he did. It was, you know, he did well, Quigg. He stopped the best opponent of his career by far in 2 rounds. However, I would have almost, the way Frampton dealt with Martinez over 12 by comprehensively outclassing him, I would almost say was more impressive than Scott Quigg. You know, almost say that, because Scott Quigg, in my opinion, even though it was only 4 or 5 minutes into the fight, was losing the fight and caught Martinez with a good shot, and, you know, fair play to him, got the job done, and credit to him for that. But he was losing for the first 4 or 5 minutes, and I don't think when Scott Quigg fights other opponents, his power is necessarily going to be enough to get the job done at top 10 level in the world. I just don't view him as that hard a puncher. Yeah, Eddie Hearn was saying, not sure any super bantamweight in the world could live with Scott Quigg's power. Well, what about all the guys who've already lived with his power already and gone 12 rounds with him? You know, so let's not buy into the fact that Scott Quigg's a massive puncher. He may be big at the weight, but for me, he didn't. He looked like he could be beatable by a Kiko Martinez type pressure fighter. The way he closed the show was risky at best. And it's hard to know about Kiko Martinez, who looks small and older than that. Hard to know where he kind of stands in the division after those 2 heavy Frampton losses, in my opinion. So nevertheless, it remained the best performance, best opponent, sorry, of Scott Quigg's career. And he is finally moving in the right direction. They're talking big things for him next. Let's hope those big things happen. Let's hope that we don't have to wait a while now and see him fight another selection of 12 rounders against opponents we've never heard of. Let's hope he gets in a real fight next time out against a real live opponent. So now, I guess the final one to discuss is Anthony Crolla versus Darley Perez, or Darley's Perez, which was a draw. A lot of people very, very upset by this. A lot of people think that Crolla was robbed. My opinion, and again, I'm going to be overcritical of our British fighters here, but possibly if I had to pick one fighter or the other, I'd go with Crolla. I do think a draw was probably a fair enough result. Crolla, he's working the jab, possibly winning the battle of the jabs, getting inside, throwing to the body, you know, trying to turn up the pace a bit. For me, Crolla just lacks that sort of extra part of his game, you know, the bit that takes you from European class to world class. The things that Crolla does well are the basics. What does he do exceptionally? In my opinion, it's very little. And this is why I find it hard to buy into Crolla and even Terry Flanagan as world champions, because they are so clearly such a long way behind the best fighters at 135 pounds. I mean, these are not guys who are near the top of the division. As I say, I think both Crolla and Terry Flanagan both get beaten by Kevin Mitchell. They both get beaten by Luke Campbell. They both get beaten by Linares. You know, I could go on. These guys are not world champions in the sense that they are towards the top of their divisions. And you know, Crolla, he's got a good story. He seems like a nice guy. He performed with credit, and maybe he has got a slight right to be annoyed that it was a draw. But did he do anything in there that made me think he deserved to be a world champion? Did he do anything in there to rip the belt away? Did he do anything in there to show that he was the top in the world? No. And I know it doesn't work like that. I know you draw up a scorecard and you score rounds 1 to 12, and then you award the belt to the winner. And the winner is whoever he is, no matter how good or bad he looks. But I just really struggle to get excited for Anthony Crolla. I don't find him an entertaining fighter to watch. And I see him as a guy who will lose whenever he steps up in competition. And this Darley's Perez is such an unknown quantity. It's so unclear how good he is. And after last night, you'd have to kind of suggest that maybe he isn't that hot. But it's actually hard for me to get super excited about Anthony Crolla. That's just my thoughts. Possibly being a bit harsh, but speaking my mind. Let's go across the pond. Let's talk Frampton versus Gonzalez. Let's talk Arreola versus Fred Cassie. Arreola is in an absolute war. I think 2 judges had it a draw. One had it a win for Arreola by 1. Do you know, I was looking on Twitter, everyone seemed to want the opponent to win. Everyone was saying that they didn't want Arreola to rob him. I didn't. The opponent, Fred Cassie, stuck to boxing, straight punches, back foot, trying to pick the jab, throw the 1-2. He did well. He did okay in spots. My honest opinion, I don't think he did enough to win at all. I thought Arreola was pressing the pace. I thought Arreola was landing the more quality shot, the heavy work. I think Arreola was hurting Fred Cassie, and I'd have probably leaned to Arreola to win. Having said that, it wasn't the most impressive performance from Arreola, and he seems to have declined a long, long way, even since the Stavern fight. You know, he's obviously not training with the best attitude, perhaps. Apparently, had he won the fight impressively, Deontay Wilder may be next. I still think that Deontay Wilder may fight Arreola. You know, Arreola's a big name, probably a better fighter than Wilder's last opponent. And let's be honest, Wilder's resume is so poor. Chris Arreola would probably be the second best name on it. I think Wilder faces Arreola, and I think that Chris Arreola in his current form, you know, probably doesn't pose too much threat to Deontay Wilder. You know, I know Arreola's a big puncher and everyone thinks Wilder's got a glass jaw, but let's be honest, if Arreola was that big a puncher, he'd have got Fred Cassie out of there last night, who was much smaller than him and, you know, favoured to go out within a few rounds. So if that fight does happen next, I'd be on Deontay Wilder's side. I think he'd have a very good chance of winning. And Arreola would have a small puncher's chance. Frampton versus Gonzalez. Now, I was watching this on mute on my TV, and I had the Sky Show on elsewhere, so I was kind of flicking between the two. And I thought I saw Frampton go down out of the corner of my eye, and I couldn't believe it. So I quickly turned it off mute, and unbelievably, he went down twice in the first round. He got rocked badly, I think, in the third round. And let's make no mistake about it. People on Twitter were saying, oh, it's a flash knockdown this, it's a flash knockdown that. Frampton was hurt. This Gonzalez was catching him with big, clean punches and hurt him and dropped him. Yeah, Frampton went on to win by relatively wide margins. Frampton's boxing was very visually pleasing. You know, he's very attractive combination punching, and he did look like a class act in there as usual. But nevertheless, this Gonzalez, who is a low-rated opponent, I think Eddie Hearn said to Boxer Academy, the 11th best Mexican in the division, was landing big punches on Crolla at any point, and this guy was live in the fight. I mean, you sometimes wonder how you read form. I mean, is it just that Kiko Martinez isn't actually that good? And, you know, Frampton isn't the best Vincent sliced bread, you know. It's hard to know, but Frampton versus Scott Quigg, I must say after last night, is a much more even fight than I had it previously. I've always been quite critical of Frampton Quigg. I've always said, like, it's not really an exciting fight to me. It's a fight that I anticipate Carl winning with ease. Well, after last night, I may have to rethink that, you know. Bear with me for one moment. Yeah, I mean, I guess Carl was... Yes, Quigg did destroy Martinez in 2 rounds, whereas Frampton went, I think, 21 rounds with him. Admittedly, you know, Martinez maybe had more desire, more hunger when he was up against Carl Frampton first time round. But yeah, you know, Frampton looked beatable last night. He looked beatable. He still had his elements of class, but yeah, he looked very beatable. And Scott Quigg did put in a career best performance, so it's hard to sort of ascertain where they are. I think Frampton said at the end of the fight he felt tight at the weight, would maybe look to move up to featherweight. I guess that's certainly a possibility, but to my eye, Scott Quigg is a much bigger man than Carl Frampton, a much bigger man. And I think Quigg could potentially follow him up to featherweight. I know the other thing that is potentially happening for Quigg could be a fight against one of the McDonald brothers. They move up to super bantam from bantam. So, yeah, maybe there's a few options for Scott Quigg. That'll probably be pay-per-view next day. Gavin McDonald versus Scott Quigg. Tivitat, disappointing match for Wilder. He's saying Arreola is a disappointing matchup for Wilder. I'd like to see Brown versus Wilder. Fat chance. Yeah, I think Arreola was, I think Wilder was offered that Lucas Brown fight, wasn't he? But he didn't take it. Lucas Brown's a very beatable fighter. I feel he's somewhat overrated, I must admit. Likeable guy, educated bouncer category, similar to Arreola, you know, not much skill, not much pace, not much athleticism, big power, big guy, strong, big chin. Maybe he could cause Wilder some problems, but again, I'd pick Wilder in that fight. Yeah, I'm not sold on Wilder, but at the minute, Wilder's recent performances tell me he's slightly above that educated bouncer level. You know, he's going to beat the Alex Leopards of this world. He's probably going to beat the Chris Arreola of this world. It's the fighters who can move and have technical capability who are going to cause him problems because he's so technically flawed. A guy like Chris Arreola probably isn't going to bring out great technical flaws. A guy like Eddie Chambers might. So that's my thoughts on that one to the tab. Yeah, so all in all, a few interesting fights there. Let's talk Chavez Jr. and Arthur Abraham briefly. Arthur Abraham won by 6th round KO over Stieglitz. I didn't watch the fight. I've read that Abraham is pretty dominant in the fight. He's landing on Stieglitz with ease, and Stieglitz looked terrible. It could be that Stieglitz is coming to an end of his career. Hopefully this brings to a close the Arthur Abraham versus Stieglitz fights. You know, I think we've been there, done that, got the T-shirt. I think we've seen enough of these two in the ring together. So I'd like to know where Abraham goes next. 168 pound is a very, very live division. Yeah, Arthur Abraham, he's been a champion for so long now. I'd like to see him try and unify. Perhaps if George Groves wins, they could do George Groves versus Arthur Abraham. You know, that obviously they're the same promoter, Sauerland. That would be an interesting fight. And then the winner could fight James DeGale maybe for 3 belts. You know, I think that would be an interesting way of doing it, because I'm slightly, and I appreciate I'm not Arthur Abraham's target market. His target market is the German boxing fans, but I'm slightly bored of seeing Arthur Abraham in against another European opponent or in against another Paul Smith or Robert Stieglitz level opponent. I'd quite like to see him, you know, he's proven that he's slightly above that level now. I'd quite like to see him, you know, go down the unification route if at all possible, and not just hold hostage that belt against top 20 level opposition. Chavez Jr. outpointed his opponent, unbelievably missed weight, even though he set 170 pound catch weight against the guy who was formerly a light middleweight. He came in at 170.8 pounds. You know, is this guy ever going to make weight? What's the point in even having weight classes if you're Chavez Jr.? He just does what he wants, doesn't he? You know, it's really poor. And if I was a world champion at 168 and I was fighting Chavez Jr., I would be putting in a disgusting financial penalty into the contract for his weight. Because you know it must be killing him to get down to 168. So I'd either force him to kill himself to get down to 168, or I'd do something, you know, $200,000 for each pound you miss it by, something of that nature. Because you've got to be compensated and remunerated for going in against a guy who doesn't even make the weight. It's so basic, you know. You spend your time cutting down, dieting on a treadmill, wearing a sweatsuit, you know, and this guy's just out there eating burgers. It's not fair. It's not fair, and he needs to be pulled up on it. Teeds Duel, I hope I pronounced that correctly, has joined. He'd also like to see Brown versus Wilder. That way you can get a better judgment on both, I think. Yeah, I mean, for me, we kind of know where both guys are now. Paul Brown looked terrible in his last fight against Rudenko. If you compare and contrast Brown's win over Rudenko to Hughie Fury's, you can see what I mean about technical deficiencies, lack of athleticism. For me, Brown is, the bouncer. Quigg also says, I think Abraham Murray is a possible fight. Maybe. I wouldn't even rule Martin Murray out of that fight, actually. So that would be possibly a 60-40 in Abraham's favour. But again, it's another one of these opponents that Abraham tends to fight, isn't it? The Stieglitzes of the world, the Paul Smiths of the world. But he's had that belt for so long, I'd like to see him fight someone top 5. Hello Bruce. Abraham mentioned a fight with Felix Sturm in a post-fight interview. I don't think he will go above that in opposition, which means no unification. Yeah, Felix Sturm, I understand, is a very big name out in Germany. He seems to have a bizarrely high following and, seems to be a rated opponent. So, yeah, maybe that is a fight that would get interest domestically. It would be a payday for both. Sturm lost last time out to that Fedor Chudinov, though, didn't he? So he's hardly the danger man at 168 pounds. So it's another disappointing fight, if you ask me. So I think we've talked briefly about all the fights. Luke Campbell. I didn't even do that on purpose. Luke Campbell versus Tommy Coyle last night on Sky. I mean, that was cringeworthy. Cringeworthy. They named it Rumble in the Humber. I think somebody tweeted me last night. Dull Hull, and I like the name Dull Hull. I mean, these two guys, the lack of star quality on show in the ring last night when these two were doing their little chat together was really, really telling. They looked. They didn't look like superstar boxers or celebrity boxers. They just, they were dull as dishwater, really. And I'm not really looking forward to that on August the 1st. Quite looking forward to seeing Dillian White on the undercard, but that's the only thing really to look forward to on that side. So yeah, it's a lot of boxing. I've tried to give brief thoughts on all of the fights involved. I've been chatting now for 35 minutes, something like that. So I won't stay on too much longer. I appreciate everyone's got Sundays to do. I'll stay on for another 5 minutes. If you've got any questions, any fights, any comments, leave them in the comments in the chat section. I'll address them before I go out. But yeah, you've got your 5-minute warning to get them in. Ross, hello Ross. Frampton looked anxious until he started using the jab. Yeah, I think it was more to do with the fact that the guy's power was upsetting him. He wasn't used to the power the guy had, and that kind of made him a bit more tentative. He's not used to being put on his arse in fights, and it may not be the last time that happens. Well, maybe he was tight at the weight, we'll see, but Frampton doesn't look like a massive guy at the weight for me. He didn't look like the big man in the ring last night compared to his opponent. He doesn't look like a big guy compared to Scott Quigg, so I don't know, maybe there's just an issue with how he's making weight as opposed to the actual weight itself. Sort of Carl Cobra Frops doing an interview with IFL TV. Priceless as ever. Lots of third person going on. Very, very pleased with himself and his career. That was entertaining. Okay, guys. Well, I'll tell you what, I've chatted for long enough. Thanks very much for watching. Just wanted to do a brief wrap up with all my thoughts on the fights from last night. If you've enjoyed this, please give me the thumbs up and like the video.